What happens when the gilded arrogance of inherited wealth is shattered against the quiet resilience of a spirit forged in hardship? In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers pierce the clouds and fortunes are made and lost in a single heartbeat, a 20-year-old waitress named Sophie Carter is about to discover the brutal answer. For Sophie, life is a delicate balancing act of survival, a constant race against time and mounting bills. For Lucas Grant, 27-year-old heir to the Grant Industries empire, life is a consequence-free playground, a stage for his every whim. One crisp autumn evening, their two worlds collide with the force of a tectonic shift, when a plate of pan-seared scallops becomes a weapon of profound humiliation. But this is not merely a story of a young woman being broken. It is the story of what happened the next day when the monster's father, the formidable Alexander Grant, appeared not with a simple apology, but with the keys to a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The reason for this staggering gesture will dismantle everything you believe about power, punishment, and the true price of redemption. Lucas Grant moved through the world as if he owned it, which in a practical sense, he almost did. As the sole heir to his father's multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, a titan of logistics, technology, and real estate, Lucas had never encountered a door that wouldn't open or a desire that couldn't be instantly gratified. His existence was a meticulously curated highlight reel of indulgence: helicopter trips to the Hamptons for lunch, front row seats at every conceivable sporting event, and a revolving door of acolytes who mistook his wealth for a personality. His character had been shaped in a vacuum, shielded from the friction of reality that forges true strength. Tonight, the arena for his casual dominance was Orem Lounge, a restaurant so suffused with an air of exclusivity that its name was spoken in reverent whispers. The decor was a symphony of dark wood, burnished gold, and hushed lighting, designed to make its clientele feel as though they were dining inside a bank vault. The waiters moved with a silent, almost telepathic efficiency, their professionalism a key part of the opulent illusion. Lucas held court at the best table in the house, flanked by his two most loyal sycophants. Chad, a junior investment banker whose spine was as flexible as his morals, and Tiffany, a social media influencer whose entire self-worth was calculated in likes and brand partnerships. The sommelier looked at me as if I'd asked for a screw top, Lucas sneered, swirling a glass of Montrachet that cost more than the average monthly rent in the city. As if his whole pathetic existence isn't just serving fermented grape juice to people who could buy his entire village and turn it into a quail hunting reserve. Chad chuckled on cue, a practiced, hollow sound. He should be thanking you for the education, my man. Seriously. Tiffany, angling her phone to capture the perfect shot of her diamond bracelet against the wine glass, added without looking up, "The service here is like, totally slipping. It's sad." Sophie Carter heard the comment as she approached, a heavy tray balanced expertly on one hand. She kept her expression a carefully constructed mask of serene neutrality, a skill she had honed over 3 years in the punishing world of fine dining. At 20, Sophie wasn't serving Michelin-adjacent cuisine because she loved it. She was serving it because it was the highest-paying job she could get that offered the flexibility she needed. Her world was a universe away from the gilded cage Lucas Grant inhabited. It was a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Queens, an apartment she shared with her grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor, who had raised Sophie after her parents died, was in the tightening grip of early-onset Alzheimer's. The disease was a cruel thief, stealing memories and leaving confusion in its wake. Sophie's every waking moment, every grueling shift, was dedicated to a single, desperate goal: saving enough money to get Eleanor into a specialized memory care facility called The Willows, a place renowned for its compassionate care and innovative art therapy programs. Sophie, an art history student at Hunter College, clung to the belief that art could be the one language her grandmother could still understand. Every dollar she earned, every tip that wasn't immediately swallowed by rent or utilities, went into a simple shoebox she labeled Eleanor's Haven. It was never, ever full enough. "Is everything to your satisfaction this evening?" Sophie asked, her voice a model of professional grace as she placed a small plate of amuse-bouche on the table. Lucas didn't even grant her a glance. He gestured dismissively at his plate of seared scallops with a saffron risotto. "What is this?" he asked, poking a perfectly caramelized scallop with his fork as if it were a slug. The risotto is grainy, and the saffron tastes like it came from a spice jar in a college dorm. Did the chef learn to cook from a YouTube tutorial? Sophie's professional smile remained cemented in place, but a familiar tension coiled in her stomach. I do apologize, sir. I can have the kitchen prepare a fresh one for you immediately. And wait another 20 minutes? I don't have time for your kitchen's incompetence, Lucas snapped, his voice gaining a sharp, venomous edge. Chad and Tiffany exchanged a small, anticipatory smirk. The show was beginning. Of course not, sir, Sophie said, her own heart rate starting to climb. She recognized the archetype instantly. This wasn't a man with a complaint. This was a predator looking for prey. I will inform the manager, Mr. Dubois, and we will, of course, remove the item from your bill. Remove it from the bill? Lucas finally lifted his head. In his eyes, a cold and startlingly empty shade of blue locked onto hers. You think this is about money? I could buy this restaurant and have it bulldozed by noon tomorrow. This is about a standard. It's about a basic level of competence, a concept you are clearly struggling with. A muscle in Sophie's jaw tightened. She could feel the stares of diners at the surrounding tables. The humiliation was a hot, creeping flush rising up her neck. She thought of Eleanor, who had looked at her with vacant eyes that morning, unable to remember her name for a full minute. That was real. That was a struggle. This was just a spoiled, overgrown child playing with his dinner. I understand, sir. My apologies, she repeated, her voice a fraction tighter than before. But Lucas was not finished. He was building to a crescendo, crafting an anecdote he could share for weeks. With a look of theatrical contempt, he picked up the heavy ceramic plate. Let me show you, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, what I think of this competence. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he didn't just toss the food. He deliberately and with practiced aim upended the entire plate directly onto the front of Sophie's crisp white blouse. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the restaurant. The rich golden risotto and buttery scallops slid down her front, the vibrant saffron sauce painting a grotesque yellow smear across her chest like a wound. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Tiffany's poorly suppressed snort of laughter. Sophie stood frozen, the initial shock giving way to a wave of white-hot rage and shame that threatened to buckle her knees. The warmth of the sauce felt scalding, a physical brand of his contempt. She looked down at the humiliating mess, a modern art masterpiece of entitlement, and then slowly she lifted her gaze back to Lucas Grant's smirking face. In that instant, the mask of the deferential waitress didn't just crack, it vaporized. For a fleeting second, she saw past the billion-dollar heir and saw him for what he was. A hollow, pathetic boy, starved for an attention he didn't know how to earn. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply held his cold, empty gaze, her own dark, intelligent eyes burning with a fire he had never encountered in his insulated world. I hope that performance, she said, her voice shaking with a fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any shout, was worth the price of your dignity. Without waiting for a reply, she turned on her heel and walked away, her back ramrod straight. She left behind a tableau of stunned silence, a lingering scent of saffron and degradation, and a spoiled young man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. She never saw the restaurant manager, Mr. Dubois, scurrying to Lucas's table, bowing and scraping, profusely apologizing for her behavior. She didn't hear Lucas laugh it off, tossing a black, featureless credit card onto the table and saying, just take care of the mess, and her severance. She was already in the staff locker room, the tears of pure, undiluted rage finally breaking free as she ripped off the stained shirt, knowing it was a stain that money couldn't buy and soap could never truly wash out. The walk from Mr. Dubois' office to the service exit was a gauntlet of shame. The manager, a man whose spine appeared to be constructed from overcooked pasta whenever a wealthy patron was near, had been clinically detached. Sophie, we cannot have such altercations, he had said, studiously examining a wine stain on his blotter, refusing to meet her eyes. The Grant family are among our most valued clients. You provoked the young man. He threw his dinner on me. Sophie's voice was a ragged whisper of disbelief. And your response was insubordinate and unprofessional, Dubois countered, his tone absolute. Orem Lounge has a reputation to uphold. It is best for all parties if we terminate your employment, effective immediately. Here is your final paycheck and a small discretionary amount for your trouble. The discretionary amount was $200. Hush money, an insult layered on top of an injury. Sophie didn't protest further. She knew the futility of it. In this stratosphere, the customer wasn't just right. They were a deity, and Lucas Grant was Zeus on his throne. She changed into her street clothes, shoved the soiled uniform into her tote bag like a piece of contaminated evidence, and stepped out into the biting November air, the glittering lights of Manhattan blurring into a cruel mockery through her tears. The subway ride back to Queens was an agonizing crawl through her own personal hell. Every screech of the train's wheels, every blank face of a fellow passenger, was a reminder of the fragile world she inhabited, a world where one rich man's tantrum could detonate her carefully constructed life. When she finally climbed the 4 flights of stairs and unlocked the door to her apartment, the familiar scent of old books and chamomile tea greeted her. Eleanor was sitting in her favorite armchair, a faded photo album open on her lap. She looked up as Sophie entered, her eyes clouded with confusion for a moment before a flicker of recognition dawned. "Sophie, dear, you're home early." Then she saw her granddaughter's face, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the bruised look in her eyes. "Oh, my sweet girl, what happened?" The story spilled out of Sophie in a torrent of anguish and indignation. She described the sneers, the condescension, and the final degrading act. Eleanor listened, her brow furrowed, her hands clutching the photo album. When Sophie finished, Eleanor reached out and took her hand. "Some people," Eleanor said, her voice lucid and sharp with a clarity that sometimes broke through the fog, "have everything money can buy, but they are bankrupt in their souls." Later that night, after helping Eleanor to bed, Sophie sat alone in the quiet kitchen. She took out the Eleanor's Haven shoebox. She counted the crumpled bills. With the loss of her job, the willows seemed to recede, not just to the horizon, but to another galaxy entirely. The despair was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant had already forgotten the incident. It was a footnote in an evening that ended with champagne at a rooftop bar. The waitress was not a person. She was a disposable prop in his personal drama, a momentary inconvenience that had been efficiently dealt with. He woke up the next day around noon in his sun-drenched penthouse, a vague headache the only lingering effect of his night out. He had no idea that the quiet, dignified girl he had tried to humiliate was not just a waitress. She was a student of history, a keen observer of details, and she had noticed something about him, a small, almost imperceptible detail that no one else would have seen. In that moment of intense confrontation, as she had stared into his eyes, she had also noticed the unique, custom-made signet ring on his right hand. It wasn't the gaudy gold that caught her eye, but the crest itself, a strange combination of a ship's sextant and a weaver's shuttle. It was an unusual, almost anachronistic design. For a fleeting second, her art historian's brain had cataloged it, filed it away as an oddity, before the wave of humiliation washed all other thoughts away. It was a seemingly insignificant detail, a piece of useless information. But the echoes of Lucas's actions were already traveling through channels far beyond his control, and that tiny detail would soon prove to be anything but useless. Alexander Grant at 57 operated on a different plane of existence than his son. He had not inherited his empire. He had forged it from nothing but grit, foresight, and a capacity for work that bordered on inhuman. His office, occupying the entire top floor of the Grant Industries Tower, was a testament to his character. Minimalist, functional, and offering a panoramic view of the city he had conquered. It was less an office and more a command center for a global operation. Here he tracked commodity prices, political shifts, and technological disruptions with the same unwavering focus. And with that same focus, he tracked his son. He loved Lucas, but it was a love shadowed by a deep and gnawing disappointment. He saw the bright, curious boy he'd raised slowly curdle into a preening caricature of privilege. Alexander had given his son every advantage, but in doing so, he feared he had deprived him of the one thing that had shaped his own life: struggle. He was a man haunted by his own success, by the fear that the fortune he built to secure his family's future had, in fact, poisoned its air. He was a father who had outsourced his son's upbringing to boarding schools and trustees, always chasing the next deal, and he was beginning to understand the catastrophic cost of that choice. Alexander did not learn of the incident at Orem Lounge from a gossip column. He learned of it from Elias Vance, a quiet, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s who served as his personal advisor, archivist, and confidant. Elias's official title was Head of Special Projects, but his real job was to be Alexander's eyes and ears, to see the things Alexander was too busy to notice. Elias entered the office without knocking and placed a single tablet on the polished obsidian desk. "There was an incident last night, Alexander," he said, his voice calm and even. "It involves Lucas." On the screen was not a news report, but a high-resolution security still from Orem Lounge, time-stamped precisely. It captured the moment of impact, the arc of the food, the splash of yellow sauce, and the look of frozen shock on Sophie Carter's face. Below it was a concise report detailing the event, the subsequent firing of the waitress, and a preliminary background file on her. Alexander stared at the image, his face hardening into a mask of granite. It wasn't the potential for bad press that enraged him. His PR team could make any scandal disappear. It was the sheer, unadulterated ugliness of the act, the gleeful cruelty on his son's face. It was the public performance of a profound moral rot. This was not the act of a future leader. It was the thuggery of a petty tyrant. He felt a familiar, bitter cocktail of emotions, white-hot anger at Lucas, and a cold, heavy sense of failure in himself. This was his legacy. This empty, cruel boy was the culmination of his life's work. "Elias," Alexander said, his voice a low growl, "get me everything on this young woman, Sophie Carter. I want to know everything. Her family, her schooling, her financial situation, everything." He pointed a finger at the screen. "And I want a full profile on this manager, Dubois. I want to know where he parks his car, what kind of wine he drinks, and every skeleton in his closet." "Right away, Alexander." "And Elias," Alexander added, his voice dropping even lower. "Orem Lounge, the holding company that owns it. Find a controlling interest and buy it. I don't care what it costs. I want it done by morning. I want to own the ground they stand on. Consider it done." For the next hour, Alexander sat in his chair, the glittering city spread out beneath him like a carpet of jewels. But he felt no triumph. He felt only the icy resolve of a surgeon preparing for a radical, life-or-death operation. He had been too patient, too hopeful that Lucas would mature on his own. He had been wrong. His son wasn't just lost. He was becoming a disease, shielded from consequence by the very fortress of wealth Alexander had constructed. The time for hope was over. The time for intervention had arrived. The comprehensive dossier from Elias arrived on his encrypted tablet less than 2 hours later. It was thorough, precise, and heartbreaking. He read about Sophie's academic scholarships, her passion for Renaissance art. He read about her parents' tragic death in a car accident when she was a child. Then he came to the section on her grandmother, Eleanor Carter. He read about the Alzheimer's diagnosis, the rapidly escalating costs of care, and the desperate, quiet battle Sophie was waging. He saw a note from Elias's inquiries about a shoebox fund labeled Eleanor's Haven. A ghost of a memory stirred within Alexander. He remembered his own mother in the final years of her life, struggling with a debilitating illness. He remembered the helpless rage he felt at a system where the quality of one's final days was determined by the size of one's bank account. This girl, Sophie, was fighting the same battle he had once fought, and his son, his own flesh and blood, had just taken away her sword and shield for a moment of cheap amusement. This was no longer just about punishing Lucas. It was about restoring a cosmic balance his son had so carelessly upended. A bold, unconventional plan began to crystallize in his mind. It was a plan of shocking audacity, designed to plunge Lucas into the very reality he held in such contempt. He looked at the digital file for the Penthouse apartment at 157, the one he had just purchased as a 28th birthday present for Lucas. It was a palace in the sky, a monument to a life of unearned privilege. A new, far more interesting use for it now presented itself. He picked up his secure line. Elias, the new penthouse at 157. Have the deed and all paperwork transferred to a new owner, effective immediately. Her name is Sophie Carter. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Even the unflappable Elias Vance was momentarily stunned. Alexander, are you certain? Perfectly, Alexander said, his voice like flint. And find out where she lives. I will be paying her a visit myself, tomorrow morning. That evening, the confrontation with Lucas was swift and brutal. Alexander had summoned him to the family's cavernous library, a room paneled in mahogany and filled with the silent judgment of generations of grand ancestors. You wanted to see me? Lucas asked, affecting an air of casual nonchalance that didn't quite reach his eyes. Alexander didn't waste time with pleasantries. He turned his tablet around, displaying the frozen image from the restaurant. Explain this. Lucas's bravado evaporated. He stammered, falling back on the familiar narrative of victimhood. It was nothing. The waitress was incompetent. She had an attitude. The service was a joke. You behaved like a gangster, Alexander cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. You humiliated a working woman for sport. You used your power not to build, but to break. You think the Grant name is a shield for that kind of thuggery? I have a certain standard to uphold, Lucas blustered, his voice rising. I am protecting our name from being associated with mediocrity. Alexander let out a short, harsh laugh, devoid of all humor. Our name? You have no concept of what our name means? It was built on sweat, on risk, on respecting the people who work for you, from the boardroom to the mailroom. Real power, Lucas, is restraint. What you displayed was the pathetic tantrum of a weak, insecure child. The words struck Lucas like a physical blow. That's not fair. Fair, the word exploded from Alexander. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you about that incompetent waitress. Her name is Sophie Carter. She's an honor student at Hunter. Her parents are dead. She is the sole caregiver for her grandmother, who has Alzheimer's. That job you so casually had her fired from? That was the only thing keeping her dream alive of getting her grandmother into a facility that can give her the dignity she deserves. You didn't just throw food on a girl, Lucas. You threw it on her grandmother's last hope. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to suck the air from the room. You, who have never known a single day of hardship, took it upon yourself to crush a woman who possesses more character and resilience in her little finger than you have in your entire coddled existence. Lucas was speechless, shaken by the depth and detail of his father's knowledge. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Get out, Alexander commanded, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Go back to your palace in the sky. We will speak again when I decide we will speak again. Enjoy your evening. Humiliated and reeling, Lucas fled the library, the weight of his father's contempt a physical burden. He drove back to the city not with anger, but with a strange, sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. For the very first time in his life, a hairline crack had appeared in the impenetrable armor of his entitlement. The next morning, Sophie Carter woke to the sound of Eleanor calling her name from the other room, her voice laced with fear and confusion. It was one of the bad days. After settling her grandmother with a cup of tea and the morning news, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills she now had no way to pay. Despair was a cold, bitter coffee at the back of her throat. That's when the knock came. It was a firm, resonant knock, completely out of place on their flimsy apartment door. She opened it to find a man who looked like he had stepped out of the pages of Forbes magazine. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke suit that whispered its expense rather than shouted it, and he radiated an aura of quiet, absolute authority. Standing just behind him was a more unassuming, older gentleman. It was Alexander Grant and Elias Vance. Miss Carter? Alexander asked, his voice polite but commanding. My name is Alexander Grant. May we have a moment of your time? Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. The father, the architect of the dynasty that had just trampled her life. Her first instinct was to slam the door. Instead, she found herself stepping aside, a strange curiosity overriding her fear. Alexander stepped into the small, clean but worn apartment. His eyes took in everything. The faded floral wallpaper, the stack of art history textbooks on a coffee table, the photograph of a smiling, vibrant Eleanor on the mantelpiece. "What do you want?" Sophie asked, her voice more defiant than she felt. Alexander met her gaze directly. There was no pity in his eyes, only a profound seriousness that she found unnerving. "Miss Carter, I am not here to offer you an apology. Words from me would be an insult to what was done to you. I am here because my son's actions created a debt, and I am a man who believes all debts must be paid. In full." He paused, then Elias stepped forward and placed a sleek black leather portfolio on her kitchen table. "This is not a settlement, Miss Carter. It is not hush money. It is a business proposal." Sophie stared at him, bewildered. "A business proposal?" "Mr. Grant, I'm a waitress. Or, I was." "You are far more than that," Alexander stated. "Elias, if you would." Elias opened the portfolio. Inside, she didn't see legal documents or checks. She saw architectural renderings of a beautiful modern building. She saw program outlines for art therapy, music engagement, and reminiscence workshops. At the top of the first page in elegant script were the words, "The Eleanor Carter Center for Art and Memory." Sophie felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. What is this?" "It is a new flagship project for the Grant Foundation," Alexander explained. "A state-of-the-art memory care facility dedicated to an arts-based approach to dementia care. The first of its kind. We are prepared to fully fund its construction and operation. Indefinitely." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And we want you to run it." Sophie could only stare, speechless. Run it? Her, a 20-year-old art student? "But why?" she finally whispered. "Why me?" "Because you understand its purpose in a way no Ivy League administrator ever could," Alexander said. "Because you have the passion, the first-hand knowledge of the need. We can hire accountants and project managers. We cannot hire a soul. The position of executive director comes with a salary, of course, full medical benefits for you and your grandmother, and a budget at your discretion." He then gestured to a single, heavy key resting on top of the documents. It was not a car key. It was a high-security key card with a sleek, minimalist design. "What's that?" Sophie asked, her mind struggling to process the surreal turn her life had taken. "That," Alexander said, the first hint of his true, audacious plan revealing itself, "is the key to your new office. And your new home. It's the penthouse at 157. The one I originally bought for my son. He let that detonate in the quiet apartment. I believe in a hands-on approach to philanthropy, Miss Carter. I am also a firm believer in poetic justice, which brings me to the second part of my proposal, your first staff member." The air in the small Queen's apartment was thick with a silence that seemed to hum with impossible energy. Sophie looked from the architectural plans for a facility named after her grandmother to the billionaire standing by her worn-out kitchen table, his expression unreadable. "My first staff member?" Sophie repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The proposal was so vast, so life-altering, she was certain there had to be a cruel, hidden catch. "My son, Lucas," Alexander stated, the name spoken with the cold precision of a surgeon identifying a tumor, "is the product of my greatest failure. I shielded him from the world, and in doing so, I made him weak and cruel. That ends now. As of this morning, I have systematically severed his access to every trust fund, every bank account, every credit card bearing the Grant name. His phone has been disconnected. The keys to his sports car have been repossessed. For all intents and purposes, he is penniless and homeless." Alexander's plan, in all its ruthless, magnificent detail, began to unfold. The penthouse you will be occupying was meant to be his birthday gift. It will now serve as your home and the headquarters for the Eleanor Carter Center. You will build your foundation from the very place he considered the pinnacle of his unearned kingdom. He paused, his gaze boring into hers. "Lucas needs to learn the value of a dollar. But more than that, he needs to learn the value of a human being. He needs to understand the dignity of work. He needs to be humbled." Sophie's mind was racing, trying to keep up. "What does this have to do with me?" "Your first act as director of the center," Alexander continued, "will be to hire your first employee. I have, through my acquisition of Orem Lounge's parent company, Arrange for a new position to be created. It's an entry-level job. Minimum wage, no benefits. He let the implication hang in the air before delivering the final, stunning blow. Lucas's new job is as a janitor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He will spend his nights scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets in the very halls that house the masterpieces you study. And you, Miss Carter, will be his boss. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the punishment left Sophie speechless. It was a lesson crafted by a vengeful god of irony. Lucas, the boy who looked down on everyone, would be forced to work on his knees. He wouldn't be a victim of her revenge. He would be a subordinate in her new reality. The penthouse wasn't a gift. It was a throne from which she would oversee his fall from grace. "You want me to manage your son?" Sophie finally asked, the words feeling foreign and absurd on her tongue. "I want you to be the arbiter of his new reality," Alexander corrected. "I don't want you to be cruel. I want you to be professional. His paycheck will be routed through your foundation's payroll. He will report to you, and only you. You will approve his work hours. You will be the sole authority in his life. I want him to see you every day, not as a victim, but as the gatekeeper to his survival. I want him to understand, in the most visceral way possible, that the world does not revolve around him." He stood to his full height, a titan of industry, proposing the most personal and intricate of mergers. "The choice is entirely yours, Miss Carter. You can decline. I will walk away, and I will find another way to fund this center anonymously. Your grandmother's care will be secured regardless, but my son will have learned nothing. He will eventually get his money back and continue on his path of casual destruction. Or," he slid the portfolio and the key across the table, "you can accept. You can take this position, build something magnificent in your grandmother's name, and in the process, you will have the opportunity to teach a lesson that desperately needs to be taught. You have the chance to forge a man out of the spoiled remains of a boy." Sophie looked at the key. It wasn't just plastic and metal. It was the key to Eleanor's future, a key to a life free from the suffocating anxiety of debt. But it was also the key to a world of unimaginable power and a role she never asked for. Could she face Lucas Grant every day? Could she wield that kind of authority over the person who had so deeply humiliated her? Then she thought of his smug, contemptuous face. She thought of the yellow stain on her uniform. She thought of her grandmother's frightened, confused eyes. The fear she felt was slowly being displaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about taking the ugliest moment of her life and using it as the foundation stone for something beautiful and strong. She stood up, her movements deliberate, and picked up the penthouse key. It felt heavy in her palm, weighted with possibility. "All right, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice steady and clear, all traces of the timid waitress gone. "I accept the position. When does my first employee start?" A flicker of something, admiration perhaps, crossed Alexander Grant's face. "He starts tonight, the night shift. I've sent his new address to your phone. He is expecting a family driver to pick him up. I suggest you go introduce him to his new reality." That evening, Lucas Grant stood seething on the curb outside a dingy, furnished studio apartment in a part of the city he didn't know existed. His father's security team had unceremoniously dropped him there with 2 suitcases and a cheap burner phone. He was furious, confused, but still clinging to the belief that this was all some elaborate, dramatic lesson that would be over by morning. He was expecting a black sedan, a driver, and a summons back to his father's study for a stern lecture, followed by a return to normalcy. Instead, a yellow taxi pulled up, the back window rolled down, and he saw Sophie Carter looking at him, her expression calm and unreadable. His brain failed to compute. The waitress, here, in a taxi. "What the hell is this? Did my father send you? Are you supposed to apologize or something?" he sneered, falling back on his default arrogance. "Get in, Lucas," Sophie said, her tone devoid of any emotion. "We're going to be late." "Late for what? I'm not going anywhere with you." "You are," she stated, not as a request but as a fact. "You have a mandatory onboarding meeting with your new employer, me. Your shift at the Met starts at 10 p.m. If you're late, it will be docked from your first paycheck, which I might add won't be enough to cover your rent here if you get in the habit of being tardy. The cold, hard reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his thick skull. This wasn't a play. This was his life. Defeated and with literally nowhere else to go, he swallowed his pride and slid into the taxi. The ride uptown was a silent, suffocating ordeal. They didn't go to the grand front entrance of the Met, but to a nondescript service door in the back. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a staff corridor, Sophie handed him a wrinkled set of gray janitorial coveralls and a laminated ID badge that read, L. Grant, Facility Staff. "Your supervisor is a man named Sal," she said, her voice all business. "He'll show you your duties. You will text me at the beginning and end of each shift. Your weekly paycheck of $550 after taxes will be direct deposited into an account that I have set up for you. From that, you will pay your rent, your utilities, your food, and your transportation. Any questions?" Lucas just stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He was standing in front of the woman he had assaulted with risotto, and she was dictating the terms of his existence. "Enjoy your first night at work, Lucas," she said, turning to leave. She paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing. My grandmother loves the Impressionist wing. Make sure you leave it spotless." The first weeks were a blur of misery for Lucas. The work was grueling, mindless, and physically exhausting. He mopped endless marble floors, scrubbed toilets, and emptied trash cans filled with the refuse of the thousands of people who flocked to the museum each day. He worked in solitude, surrounded by priceless treasures of human history, feeling more worthless than he ever had in his life. His colleagues, career janitors, and maintenance workers treated him with a detached suspicion. They knew who he was. The story of the billionaire's son being forced to work as a cleaner was the stuff of instant legend among the staff, and they gave him no sympathy. They simply expected him to do his job. He lived in a constant state of exhaustion and simmering resentment. He tried to rebel in small ways, showing up a few minutes late, doing a sloppy job in a remote gallery. But Sophie was always one step ahead. A text would arrive. "Sal reports the floor in the Egyptian wing needs another pass. Don't clock out until it's done." Her oversight was remote, clinical, and absolute. Meanwhile, Sophie's life was transforming at lightning speed. She moved into the Penthouse, a space so vast and luxurious it felt like living on a cloud. The view of Central Park from her floor-to-ceiling windows was a constant, breathtaking reminder of how far she had come. She immediately moved Eleanor into a suite at the finest transitional care facility, while construction on the new center was fast-tracked. She threw herself into her work, proving Alexander's gamble on her was a wise one. She was a natural leader, organized, empathetic, and driven. She hired a small expert team and began building the framework for the Eleanor Carter Center. She met with architects, dementia specialists, and art therapists, her days a whirlwind of productive, meaningful activity. She was building a legacy. Lucas was just taking out the trash. About a month into his sentence, Lucas hit rock bottom. His meager paycheck was gone 2 days after he received it, spent on a single defiant, expensive meal. He was left with nothing for the rest of the week. Humiliated, he was forced to text Sophie, "I need an advance." Her reply came 3 hours later. "Advances are not company policy. However, the staff cafeteria at the Met offers 1 free meal per shift to all employees. I suggest you take advantage of that." That night, starving and defeated, he ate a stale tuna sandwich under the harsh lights of the staff break room, surrounded by men and women whose lives he had never once considered. It was in that moment of profound humiliation that the first crack in his arrogant facade began to show. This wasn't a punishment anymore. This was just life for everyone else. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a slow, gradual awakening. Working at night, alone in the silent galleries, he started to actually look at the art. He found himself mesmerized by the raw emotion in a Van Gogh, the serene power of a Roman statue, the intricate detail of a medieval tapestry. He remembered his father dragging him through museums like this as a child, how he had been bored and restless, completely oblivious to the beauty around him. One night, while cleaning the restoration wing, he saw a team of conservators working late on a 17th century Dutch painting. He watched fascinated as one of them, a woman with delicate hands and intense focus, painstakingly removed centuries of grime from the canvas. He started to ask Sal, his supervisor, questions about the art, about the history of the museum. Sal, a gruff man who had worked at the Met for 30 years, was surprised but began to share stories. It was during this time that Sophie's art history knowledge came into play in an unexpected way. Reviewing the museum's security protocols as part of a Grant Foundation grant renewal, she noticed a discrepancy in the climate control logs for a specific storage area, the one housing delicate textiles. Her academic work had included a paper on the preservation of antique fabrics. She recognized the subtle temperature fluctuations as a potential sign of a failing HVAC unit, a disaster that could ruin priceless artifacts. She flagged it, but the museum's bureaucracy was slow to respond. Remembering Lucas was now a fixture in the museum's underbelly, she made a call. "Lucas, I need you to do something. Go to sub-level B, textile storage. Find the HVAC unit, number 7. I need you to tell me if you feel any drafts or see any condensation near the vents. It's important." Lucas, annoyed at the command but intrigued by the mystery, did as he was told. In the dark, musty storage area, he found the unit, and just as Sophie suspected, there was a small, almost invisible puddle of water on the floor beneath it in a faint cold draft. He remembered visiting wine cellars and art vaults with his father, who had obsessively taught him about the dangers of humidity. He reported his findings back to Sophie, his description precise and detailed. Armed with his first-hand account, Sophie was able to bypass the bureaucracy and get an emergency maintenance crew to the museum. They discovered a critical failure in the unit that would have catastrophically flooded the storage vault within days, destroying a collection of priceless Renaissance tapestries. The next day, she received a call from the director of the Met, who had been alerted by Alexander Grant of the situation. He was profusely grateful. "Your foundation, and your man on the inside, just saved a piece of our history, Miss Carter." That evening, Sophie called Lucas. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation that wasn't about his work schedule. "What you did last night was important, Lucas," she said, her voice holding a new note of something. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. "You saved those tapestries." "I just followed your orders," he mumbled, uncomfortable. "No," she said. "I had a theory from a data sheet. You provided the proof. You saw what others would have missed. Thank you." And then she hung up. Lucas stood in his shabby apartment, the simple, professional "thank you" echoing in his ears. It was the first time in his life he had felt a sense of genuine accomplishment, of having created value not with his wallet, but with his eyes and his mind. It was a strange, unfamiliar, and deeply satisfying feeling. It was the beginning of a change. The incident with the tapestries marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. Lucas's work at the museum became less of a punishment and more of a purpose. He developed a genuine interest in the institution, a pride in its preservation. He started talking to the curators, the security guards, the librarians, learning the intricate workings of the city within a city. He saw the passion and dedication of hundreds of people working together to protect something beautiful. He began to use his mind. He noticed inefficiencies in the waste disposal system and drafted a simple proposal that would save the museum thousands of dollars a year. He submitted it to Sal, who, shocked, passed it up the chain. It was implemented immediately. He was still a janitor. He still lived in the same crappy apartment. But he was no longer just a prisoner. He was becoming a part of something. Sophie, meanwhile, was flourishing. The groundbreaking for the Eleanor Carter Center was a major city event. She gave a speech, poised and passionate, that brought tears to Alexander Grant's eyes. She had become a force in the world of New York philanthropy, respected for her sharp intellect and her deep compassion. One afternoon, nearly a year after that fateful night at Orem Lounge, she summoned Lucas to her office, the Penthouse. He entered the magnificent space, a place he was meant to inherit, and saw it transformed. It wasn't a bachelor pad. It was a bustling nerve center for a major foundation, filled with blueprints, research papers, and a palpable sense of mission. Sophie was standing by the window, looking out over the park. "Alexander believes the punishment phase of your education is over," she said without turning around. "He's prepared to reinstate a trust for you, a modest one, Enough to live on. Lucas was silent for a long moment. A year ago, this news would have been the answer to his prayers. Now it just felt empty. I don't want it, he said, surprising both of them. Sophie finally turned to face him. Why not? Because it's not real, he said, the words coming slowly as he worked them out himself. This past year, scrubbing floors, living on nothing, it's the first real thing I've ever done. That money, it's just a shield. It stops you from having to be a person. He took a breath. I have an idea, a proposal, not for me, for the foundation. He laid a folder on her desk. Inside was a meticulously researched plan. He had used his innate understanding of finance and his newfound ground-level perspective of the art world to create a proposal for a new wing of the Grant Foundation, a cultural heritage investment fund. It would be a for-profit venture that invested in struggling smaller museums, art restoration technologies, and historical preservation projects, using the returns to create a self-sustaining funding stream for the nonprofit work of the Eleanor Carter Center. It was smart, innovative, and brilliant. Sophie read through it, her expression unreadable. She peppered him with sharp, insightful questions, challenging his assumptions, probing for weaknesses. He answered every one, his knowledge and passion evident. Finally, she closed the folder. This is an excellent proposal, Lucas. It will need to be presented to the board. I know, he said. I'm on the board, she added. I know that too. The story did not end with a fairy tale romance. The chasm between them, carved by humiliation and power, was too wide to ever be bridged by love. But it could be bridged by something else, something harder earned, respect. Lucas presented his proposal to the foundation's board. Sophie, in her role as director, questioned him rigorously but fairly before casting the deciding vote in his favor. He was given a modest office, a small team, and a seed budget to bring his vision to life. He wasn't the heir apparent anymore. He was just an employee, a division head who reported ultimately to Sophie Carter. A year later, the Eleanor Carter Center for Art and Memory opened its doors. It was a beautiful, light-filled building, already being hailed as a revolutionary model for dementia care. On the opening day, Sophie stood by the entrance, greeting donors and families. Eleanor, her grandmother, was seated nearby, happily dabbing watercolors onto a piece of paper, a small, contented smile on her face. Alexander Grant stood beside Sophie, looking not at the building, but at her. You didn't just save my son, Miss Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You showed him what it means to build something. Instead of just owning it, you've redeemed us both. Across the lawn, Sophie saw Lucas. He wasn't schmoozing with the wealthy donors. He was talking to a group of curators from a small museum in Brooklyn, passionately explaining how his new fund could help them restore a damaged collection. He caught her eye and gave a small, respectful nod. She returned it. He was no longer the arrogant prince, and she was no longer the victimized waitress. They were two people, irrevocably linked by a single ugly act, who had each found their own way to turn that moment of degradation into a foundation for something of true, lasting value. The Penthouse keys had unlocked more than just a door. They had unlocked a prison, freeing them both into a world where a person's worth was measured not by what they inherited, but by the character they chose to build.